Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, classmates. This is our report about the Coordinated Management of Meaning Theory by W. Barnett Pierce and Vernon Cronin. The Coordinated Management of Meaning Theory, which I'll refer to as CMM for the rest of the presentation, is a theory which asserts that persons in conversation co-construct their own social realities and are simultaneously shaped by the worlds they create. Persons in conversation refer to those who are communicating with each other, creating and building a social reality during and after the process, which is communication. Simply put, every conversation has an afterlife. What we create today shapes the social reality of tomorrow. It begs the question, what are we making together? How are we making it? How can we make better social worlds? It's sort of building and maintaining social relationships. CMM, as shown in the illustration, is a purely interpretive theory as it largely requires understanding the social relationship between the persons in conversation. It is of socio-cultural tradition as it seeks to address the way our understanding of the world is constructed through human interaction. It is also of phenomenological tradition as it studies the experience lived by an individual, which varies from person to person. CMM is presented as a practical theory which was crafted to help the lives of real people in the real world better. Fields such as family therapy, mediation, and other situations dealing with social relationships use this theory in practice. An example provided by the book tackles the strange loop pattern, which is an unwanted repetitive communication pattern. A mother and father went to John Burnham, a family therapist. They talked to him about the relationship with their 14-year-old son who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a mild form of autism. As the parents opened up to him, Burnham noticed that they were trapped in a repetitive communication pattern called the strange loop. In the figure shown, the parents treat the boy with more compassion when showing symptoms of Asperger's and become demanding and impatient when the boy's symptoms decrease. Burnham suggested that rather than trying to find out whether or not the boy has Asperger's, they should try to establish what kind of relationship they want to have with their son. By focusing on what they want to make together, the relationship of the parents and the boy got progressively better. In another example from the book, a community that was ethnically diverse had an underlying tension between each other due to difference in beliefs and convictions. Now, it can be quite difficult for some to form social relationships with people from different cultures at first. However, this can be assisted through dialogic communication. Dialogic communication is a form of conversation wherein people speak in a way that makes other people want to listen and listen in a way that makes other people want to speak. This requires an open mind towards different beliefs and convictions. Through this method, people can gain confidence in speaking up about their own thoughts on certain matters and can start building on social relationships with each other. Social constructionists believe that our social environment is not something we find or discover. We create it instead. The persons in conversation are responsible for creating the social realities we live in. The figure shown is M.C. Ester's bond of union. It illustrates the following principles of the theory. Number 1. The experience of persons in conversation is the primary social of human life. Their communication literally forms who they are and creates the relationship between them. Just as with courting a person of romantic interest, getting to know each other is the first step in building a relationship. Next, the way people communicate is often more important than the context of what they say. The mood and manner that persons in conversation adopt plays a huge role in the social construction process. For example, there's a difference between oh and oh. And there are also times where a conversation is set in a particular mood to a point where you are morally obliged to respond according to how the conversation is going. This is called logical force, which is the sense of obligation a person feels to respond in a given way to what someone else has just said or done. Sort of like a I had no other choice situation. The actions of persons in conversation are reflexively reproduced as the interaction continues. Reflexivity is the process by which the effect of our words and actions bounce back and affect us. As shown in the bond of union, the ribbon represents our words and actions looping back towards us as we interact. We are always affected by the things we do. Responses from the persons in conversation may differ depending on what they say and do. It gets people to ask and answer the question, what are we making together? As social constructionists, CMM researchers see themselves as curious participants in a pluralistic world. They are curious because they cannot affirm certainty when dealing with individuals' lives, especially because our lives are subjected to ever-changing conditions. Participants because they seek to be actively involved rather than observe. They try to understand it from the perspective of those who experience what they study. They live in a pluralistic world because they believe that people create multiple truths rather than a singular truth. There are different truths in social realities of people, which widely vary from person to person, thus the belief of multiple truths. CMM draws a distinction between stories lived and stories told. Stories lived are the co-constructed actions we perform with others. They are the realities that are socially constructed when we communicate with those around us. Stories told are the narratives we use to make sense of stories lived. This is how we interpret or make sense of those stories. In stories told, you can say that you can walk on water, but in stories lived, multiple factors such as gravity, surface tension, and weight serve as limits on what you are able to do in real life. Pierce and Cronin named this theory management of meaning, which obliges us to modify and adjust our stories told to the reality of our stories lived. Coordination, or coordinated, is added because we need to work together and constantly make changes to the realities formed as we continue interacting with each other. The hierarchy model of meaning is a rank order of the relative significance of contexts, episode, relationship, identity, and culture that encompass a given story to aid interpretation. It believes that storytelling is the central act of communication. However, every story is set within multiple contexts. The speaker's message can be interpreted differently according to the multiple factors that it is formed from. Namely, these factors are the aforementioned framework of an episode, relationship between parties, self-identity of the speaker, and the culture from which they come from. Episode refers to a sequence of speech acts with a beginning and an end that are held together by a story. It is the interaction or the experience of the speaker. Relationship refers to the relationship of the speaker with the communication. It emerges from the dynamic dance over coordinated actions and managed meanings. Identity is our sense of self, our self-image. It becomes a context for how we manage meaning and is continually crafted through the process of communication. Culture describes shared webs of meanings and values, what we have learned from those who we have spent time with. People from other cultures won't interpret messages exactly the same way due to the difference in beliefs. Speech act is basically the message itself. It can be verbal and nonverbal and is considered the basic building block of the social realities we create. Really, it's about anything you say or do in a conversation. In making and managing meaning through stories told, there are a variety of models offered by Pierce and Cronin. These models help people figure out what is going on in a conversation. In the book, the author, M. Griffin, merged two of these models together, the hierarchy model of meaning and the serpentine model, as a schematic diagram of the communication process that happens in Esther's bond of union. In the figure shown, you can see that both Peter and Anne have these rings that contain identity, relationship, episode, culture, and speech act. However, both of these rings are not arranged in the same way. This is because the significance of these contexts change depending on the speech act of the person. Long story short, Peter and Anne were constantly fighting. Anne, coming from her history of family abuse, felt endangered by Peter and obtained a restraining order. Peter saw it as a betrayal and demanded that Anne pay the rent during the 2 weeks he wasn't allowed to live in his apartment. Anne refused as to not play the part of the victim. Peter presses on for retribution and is again met with Anne's refusal, and so on and so forth, yada yada yada. Looking back at the figure, Anne's groups of rings has her identity as its outermost ring. We can say that her identity is given the most weight, as we can interpret that her speech acts are largely influenced by her identity, evident in how she feels threatened by Peter, but decides to stand up for herself and refuses Peter's demands. Following her identity is her culture, which is her history of family abuse. The fact that Peter did not have the same experiences Anne had regarding family abuse makes it hard for Anne to manage meanings with Peter. Peter's outermost ring is his relationship with Anne. Peter has Anne's betrayal of the relationship fixated in his mind, causing his speech acts to be easily interpreted as attempts of retribution towards Anne. Meshing of stories lived. Coordination is the process by which persons collaborate in an attempt to bring into their vision of what is good and bad. It is being able to work the stories lived together in the social reality that is created. However, it does not necessarily mean that people have to reach an agreement when coordinating their stories lived. This is coordination without coherence, which refers to people coordinating but for quite different reasons. For example, a friend of mine could watch a certain movie because her favorite actor is the leading actor. I could watch the same movie, but only because a movie analysis is a requirement in a class I'm attending. While our reasons were entirely different, we still coordinated on watching the same movie.
So, CMM as a critical theory. CMM started as an interpretive theory where its authors are trying to describe, define, and understand the recurring patterns of communication. So, as the theory evolved, it developed a critical edge. By developing the critical edge, the CMM advocates are not satisfied anymore with just the simple description of the patterns of communication. So, they want more. So, the CMM advocates want to function as peacemakers, where if any of us are tempted to underestimate the role of assisting others on how they communicate with one another, CMM is here to remind us that communication has the power to create a social world of alienation, detachment, anger, hatred, and malice. Or one can be based by generosity, kindness, tolerance, and cooperation. So meaning, so it actually depends on how the communication process may result to either bad or good. Meaning CMM separates communication styles that are harmful from those that are helpful. Example, Pierce believes that the polarization of the electorate in the United States is both the cause and the product of communication patterns that he describes as reciprocated diatribe. He claims that what former President George Bush labeled the war on terror is reproduced and sustained by the patterns of communication that dismiss and demonize the other. Cosmopolitan communication disagree yet coordinate. CMM theorists propose an unusual type of communication as a solution for unsatisfactory or destructive patterns, believing that it will create or establish a social world where we can live with dignity, honor, and love. So, over the past 3 decades, Pierce has used number of terms to describe the communication style he values. He started calling it cosmopolitan communication. So Pierce's cosmopolitan communication assumed that there is no single truth, or if there is, that it has many faces. So they try to find ways of coordinating with others with whom they do not and perhaps should not agree. Although Pierce like Although Pierce liked the concept of cosmopolitan communication, Pierce also uses the term dialogue the same way that Jewish philosopher Martin Buber does. He believes in the optimum form of interaction. For Buber, dialogic communication involves remaining in the tension between holding our own perspective while being profoundly open to the other. For Buber, dialogic communication involves remaining in a tension between holding our own perspective while being profoundly open to the other. So, just like in a debate, both of you disagree with each other, yet you are still in coordinate. Both of you don't agree with each other's opinion, yet you are still open for a talk. You're still receiving information that we might learn something new that will change what we think or even who we are. Ethical reflection, Martin Buber's Dialogic Ethics. Martin Buber was a German Jewish philosopher and theologian who died in 1965. His ethical approach focuses on relationships between people rather than on moral codes of conduct. He contrasted two types of relationship, I it and I thou. So, in an I it relationship, we are treating the person as a thing to be used, an object to be manipulated. So, we come together as individuals intent on creating only an impression. So, deceit is actually a way to maintain appearances. So, in an I thou relationship, we regard our partner as the very one we are. This implies that we will seek to experience the relationship as it appears to the other person. He says we can do this only through dialogue. For Buber, dialogue is a synonym for ethical communication. He also stated here that dialogue is mutuality in conversation that creates the between, through which we help each other to be more human. So, dialogue is also not only a morally appropriate act, but it is also a way to discover what is ethical in our relationship. So, the conversation is much more easier and much more effective if you have something in related with, since it requires self disclosure, confirmation, and vulnerability with the other person. So Buber used the image of the narrow ridge to be a metaphor of I thou. So communication ethicist Ron Arnett of the Quesnay University notes that living the narrow ridge philosophy requires a life of personal and interpersonal concern, which is likely to generate a more complicated existence than that of the egoist or the selfless martyr. Despite the tension, many interpersonal theorists have carved out ethical positions similar to Buber's philosophy. Pierce is also attracted to Buber's core belief that dialogue is a joint achievement that cannot be produced on demand, yet occurs among people who seek it and are prepared for it. So Pierce is attracted to Buber's core belief that dialogue is a joint achievement that cannot be produced on demand, yet occurs among people who seek it and are prepared for it. Lastly, critique three theories, three appraisals. So overall, interpretive theory promotes better understanding of people and the social works where they create through their conversation. They also value curiosity, involvement, and appreciation of difference rather than the detached, aloof confidence of someone. Pierce and his associates changed the social world of Cupertino, California. Although many objectivist theorists ignore or dismiss CMM at first because of its social constructivist assumptions, yet it gathered widespread interest among scholars, among communication scholars to be exact. So CMM's models of communication went through a wide range of qualitative research, such as textual and narrative analysis, case studies, interviews, participant observation, ethnography, and collaborative action research. CMM has a reputation of being confusing mix of ideas since it lacks clarity. Critical terms, most scholars don't consider CMM as a critical theory because Pierce and Cronin did not insist that power is the pivotal issue in all human relationships. So, as a CMM as a practical theory is the excellent model for it. However, the most frequent plea was for user-friendly explanations expressed in easy to understand terms. So, as a feedback of a dance movement therapist, Gabriel Parker stated that her counseling trainees often find CMM ideas exciting. However, due to its language that are too full of jargon, most of them feel intimidated. So that is why this is crucial for a call of clarity.